Alrighty. Okay. The sacralization of Christianity, the re-sacralization of nature and society by Christianity. Just want to make sure I'm live, actually. Okay, it's live. Sweet. Alright. In reply to the above question, I might refer again to the theoretical formulation that I gave at the beginning of this discussion. When Christianity defeated the other religions of the Roman world, it eliminated the traditional form of the sacred among pagan populations. What belonged to the conquered was transferred to the conqueror. People who were undoubtedly converted carried with them into their Christianity the convictions about the sacred that they held already. In the 2 centuries after Constantine, in which Christianity triumphed when the empire officially became Christian and the masses entered the church for various reasons, it was not possible that there should be the threefold mutation of a deep conversion to the Christian faith, the reciprocal abundance of all previous beliefs, and the corresponding cultural transformation. It is evident that when temples dedicated to the gods of Greece and Rome were confiscated and baptized as Christian churches, the very architectural structure would remind people forcibly of the ancient religion, for example, by the division into a sacred place and a profane place. If we consider concretely the situation of the new converts, if we try to see into their minds, we shall understand that unavoidably there was a strong survival of prior beliefs and spontaneous judgments. I'm not saying that the conversions were false or hypocritical, except where they were for reasons of self-interest, such as following the emperor, or by force. What I am saying is that one cannot annul in an instant a prior mental structure, basic ideological thesis, or the grid within which life and the world are interpreted. One of the permanent keys in all this was the sacred, the distinction between the sacred and the profane, the kind of relationship with deity that rests on recognition of the sacred, etc. So sacred would mean holy, or like something with a special connection to God. It is generally allowed that the expansion of Christianity was much less rapid in general than 19th century historians stated. The rural areas remained more or less pagan. A mixture thus developed between Christian and pagan beliefs, corresponding to popular faith. It was not possible to eradicate pagan beliefs. The church preferred to absorb them, baptizing the local gods, fitting them into the global category of the saints, as we have already seen. The little gods of the tree or fountain were integrated in a general application of the same method. Naturally, we have to distinguish between the faith of humble people and the theological formulation of intellectuals. In fact, the latter do not really express the people's beliefs. To achieve a true picture of Christianity, we must not stop at the history of dogmas. Paganization is less important than sacralization. Once recognition is accorded to little local deities, it has necessarily to be admitted that certain places, the places dedicated to or by deities, are special. The church undoubtedly fought against the worship of trees and fountains, but it was forced to recognize that certain places are different or separate from others. Principally the church itself, the place of cultic celebration. The building becomes the object of a kind of consecration. It becomes a sacred place. If anything scandalous takes place in it, it can no longer be used for divine service. It must be reconsecrated. The first Christians had no particular reverence for the places where believers met and where they heard God's word and celebrated the sacraments. But once such places became splendid imperial buildings and the theology of the sacraments changed, these places, now radically different from others, were invested with the beliefs that appertained to pagan temples. God was especially present in such places. The sense of the sacred thus reappears. What is more, the church is now divided into two parts like pagan temples. The more profane part for ordinary believers, the other part, where the religious ceremony takes place, is for the priests. This is wholly typical of the recognition once again that certain places are particularly sacred. To mark the fact that the church is a sacred place, people had to make certain gestures on entering, such as covering themselves, genuflecting, or sprinkling themselves with holy water. In such gestures, we again see belief in the sacred. To approach a sacred place, one must observe a number of formalities and precautions. When believers approach the sacred place, holy water protects them against contamination, or, according to another view, against God's wrath. At the same time, certain places become sacred in the strictest sense: the tomb of martyrs, the place where miracles occur, the places where martyrs are put to death. People go on pilgrimages to such places and even want to be buried close to the tombs of martyrs. Such practices occurred very early in the church. Literally, then, Judeo-Christian desacralization is canceled out. The Bible states that the earth is the Lord's, all of it without distinction. But now, in contrast, God is closer, more present, more apprehensible in certain places. Some places are sacred, others are profane. This sacral adoration of certain places will last throughout the church's history and will embrace places where there are beatific visions of or healings. We are here in the presence of the sacred in the pure sense. With sacred places, sacred times also appear again. Paul says expressly that we are not to respect particular days or times. Human distinctions and ordinances in this regard have no value, but very quickly some days of the week, Friday is the day of the crucifixion, or Sunday is the day of resurrection, come to rank as sacred. And periods are also set aside, Advent and Lent, when people may turn especially to God, readying themselves for the celebration of Christmas and Easter, preparing by a kind of purification for the meeting with God. What we have here is a typical sacral attitude. In the Bible, the Easter communion is very open. It is not a sacral act. Hence, there has to be purification by the way of a sacral approach. The church was also led to use sacred periods in the political context of the Middle Ages. It used them to limit feudal wars. It laid down, and it had it generally accepted for a period, that one should not wage war on certain days of the week, Friday and Sunday in the first instance. This is the truce of God. All fighting must stop on these days. The days were then extended, for one could hardly kill one's neighbor on the eve of taking communion or on the day after. But as the period of truce grew longer, It gradually ceased to be respected. The important thing here, however, is to stress that certain days are separate. They have the character of sacred times. I need some water. Yeah, I think the modern Christians they're acting like pagans. They've been tricked to behave like pagans. The leadership of these churches is just letting them back into like the pagan ways. This is all obviously linked to an inner mutation in faith, in particular to the new interpretation of communion of the sacrament, emphasizing the sacrifice of Jesus tended to lead already in this direction. This sacrifice, as we have said, put an end to all others and could not be reproduced. But this was not to reckon with the sacral mentality, with the need for the sacred among the masses. The need for the sacred comes to expression in the need for sacrifice to establish the relationship with deity. Remembrance of a sacrifice was not enough. Communion cannot be a simple commemoration, nor does communion satisfy popular piety when it is purely spiritual. It has to be concrete. The sacred demands concrete manifestation. Gradually, then, the doctrine of transubstantiation evolves. Piety directed to the real presence of Christ himself, his material presence in the consecrated bread. Here we have the most radical transformation. Christ's sacrifice is effectively renewed by the priest in a liturgy comprising specific rites. Naturally, the consecrated host is wholly sacred. This is determinative for sacred places and customs such as we have seen above. It is Christ himself who is present. It is important to stress that in the Gospels, Jesus never presents himself as sacred or divine as a sacred or divine person, and rejects all adoration of himself, referring in every case to his Father. With this restoration of regular sacrifice, a large element of the sacred makes a massive entry into Christianity with two important consequences. The first has to do with the opus operatum. The sacrament works autonomously. It depends on neither the celebrant, the recipient, nor God's action. Communion takes place with the reception of the host. The host works autonomously. So does baptism. The water of baptism is efficacious. The baptized are washed from original sin, and theological virtues are infused into them once and for all. They receive the indelible character of people who belong to Christ. This is a purely sacral interpretation. The object has the power. The host produces communion. The baptismal water produces the effects. Faith is not decisive. What counts is not the believer's relationship of faith with God, but the church's ritual and the object that has the sacred power of transformation. The same applies to the holy water used on entering the church, or to the palms blessed on Palm Sunday, which are supposed to guarantee the happiness of the houses in which they are placed, or to protect them against evil. As always in the world of the sacred, certain objects are supposed to have in themselves a special sacred task. Along the same lines is the reappearance in the church of the importance of the visible. It is impossible to keep to the word and to a God who is invisible and unknowable. There is a need to link up again with a visible reality that will make the sacred present. The reintroduction of the visible as a sign of revelation, in direct opposition to the revelation itself, is in every way fundamental for the restoration of the sacred in the church. Everything becomes visible. The truth of God is integrated into things that belong to our reality. We find stained glass windows. Stained glass windows. The picture books of the unlearned that are supposed to teach ignorant pagans the simplified rudiments of the sacred story. Then we have statues. This is a gigantic step. Not statues of God himself, of course, but of a whole world that has to do with God, Jesus, the Virgin, and the saints. Piety is oriented to the visible. We worship best when we see, in spite of the saying of Jesus that those are blessed who do not see and yet still believe. We then have lights, special and distinct vestments for the priests, the elevation of the host. The visible that characterize the sacred makes a massive entry into the church, and in this way believers unwittingly take the path of paganism. The visible object is typical of the sacral world and very quickly becomes sacred itself. Finally, there is the icon, in which the fusion of revelation and the image is almost fully accomplished, so that the icon is the sacred object par excellence. The new awareness of the irreplaceable importance of the visible, excluded by the religion of the world, is a decisive stage in the reinsertion of the sacred into Christian thought, faith, life, and ritual. The importance accorded to the visible forms part of the primacy of sacred objects. The force of the action is not the invisible force of God that faith alone can apprehend. Rather, it is the force of objects that we can see, handle, and use that we have to respect. We must say that in Protestantism, which was an attempt to desacralize and which profaned much of what Roman Catholicism held to be sacred, identical processes may be seen. The church has become in some sense a sacred place, and the Bible has become materially a sacred book. I recall the time when it was a scandalous matter to tear out one or more pages from a Bible. Invincibly, the sense of the sacred has invested again the very thing that was destined to destroy it. That is, I think, fascinating, that Christianity was to do away with this pagan idea that certain objects or certain places have a special relationship with God and should be treated differently. Like, the Bible should be treated differently than other books because it's a holy book, and that if you rip a page out, you're sinning against God. That's like a ridiculous pagan belief. They're putting God into visible things. No, they're not supposed to be doing that. They're acting like pagans. The second change brought about by the new view of sacrifice, a pagan view, and not at all a Christian one, was Christians aren't supposed to sacrifice because Jesus sacrificed, was to give saving and proprietary value to the sacrifice itself. If we want to please God, we have to offer him something. This is Satan. This is what Satan does. Think about this. I think Satan invaded Christianity, and he got all the Christians to worship him. Satan wants you to sacrifice things to him. If we want to please God, we have to offer him something. We thus find again the traditional idea that lies behind the throwing of a lamb into the sea by a king who is too fortunate and who has to sacrifice something so as not to lose everything. Once sacrifice occupies its place again, something that one wants or loves has to be sacrificed. Total renunciation is demanded. It becomes a virtue to make the most difficult and painful offering. The acceptance of suffering is part of the sacrifice, and suffering is exalted. All these are familiar trends in medieval Christianity, but they have nothing whatever to do with biblical thinking. That was in the new the Infinity War movie with Thanos. He had to sacrifice his daughter to get one of the gems, the soul gem. And it had to be someone he loved, or else he couldn't just sacrifice anyone. Now, at the same time, and in a corresponding manner, the reflection upon God, being led by Greek and Roman thought, radically transformed what the Bible said about God. On the one side, it analyzed the attributes of God, a God, of course, very different from the gods of polytheism, but still a God constructed by philosophy. Thus, the idea of creation underwent a radical change the moment omnipotence came to the fore. The relation between God and the world now had nothing whatever to do with what the first Christian generations believed. God was tied to his creation, and ultimately the world itself contained God. On this basis, one could find the sacred everywhere. This path led to the reappearance of persons typically connected with the sacred, such as mediators or priests. We have said that in the New Testament there were no priests. There were deacons to offer aid, prophets to preach, teachers to give instruction, and bishops to see to good order. But there were no priests because Jesus is the one unique mediator. But once the sacred reappeared in Christianity, people were needed who could carry and represent it, and who would also serve as mediators. It was not to be thought that simple believers could approach this God, the God of the new theology. Consecrated persons were required who would be dedicated to the work of mediation, who would themselves be sacred, who would be able to offer the holy sacrifices that were now being renewed. I have to drink water. I think this stuff is fascinating, but I'm mainly reading this to practice, so I practice using my voice because I never talk, since I have no friends. Okay. The priest has sacred functions that he alone can discharge. Oh wait, no, I'm not there. Such persons came within the framework of the multiple mediations that are characteristics of the sacred and that link up with what we said about the integrating of minor deities. We have the saints in mind. The priests and the saints are bearers of the sacred. They serve as indispensable screens for ordinary mortals who cannot approach the mysteries, who risk terrible dangers if they enter into a direct relation with deity. If they come unprotected into the world of the sacred is beneficent, but it has such power that if we are not equipped for this relation, it becomes maleficent. The priest has sacred functions that he can alone discharge. We find again what was typical of the pagan priest regarding role and mediation, regarding the separation of a class of specialists in the sacred who alone can deal with it, from a louse that is confined to the world of the profane. Jesus had radically abolished this distinction. With the appearance of those who represent the sacred in a positive sense, we naturally find the appearance of those who represent in a negative sense, such as wizards or witches. Here again, the mutation calls for notice. Biblically, sorcerers are possessed with a spirit that faith must expel. In the primitive church, we find a remarkable view that will persist for a long time and is very modern, namely that sorcery does not really exist. We must not believe in it. It is pure imagination. We must root it out from the minds of believers, any acceptance of the power of sorcerers. We must convince them that sorcerers play on credulity. This idea appears again in the 19th century, but what finally triumphs is belief in the devil, in evil supernatural powers that act on earth as exact counterpart of the priest, the black mass being an inversion of the mass. This is all logical, for once specialists appear who represent the sacred in a positive sense, there have to be their opposite numbers who represent it in a destructive sense. Thus, the traditional world of the sacred is almost completely reconstructed. From this point onward, one may say that Christianity is one among the many expressions of the sacred and the religious. The word sacred, which is almost never used in the New Testament, also comes back into current use. We read of sacred chants, sacred music, sacred art, sacred books, and sacred vessels, and a sacred history is taught that differs and is distinct from ordinary world history. This change of vocabulary typifies the change in mentality and religious conceptions. It marks the reappearance of the sacred by which Jewish and Christian thought had originally combated with living power. This monumental historical setback seems to me to be one of the most flagrant proofs that the sacred is integral to human existence, that the active, I do not say objective, force that constantly leads us to reconstitute a sacred universe is a permanent one. Apparently, we cannot live in the world unless it is thus constituted. Only the sacred, and not the venture proposed by Christianity, reassures us and gives both stability to the universe and a solid and objective meaning to life. I can't read anymore because my voice hurts to talk. Bye.